All right. So, just a short introduction of what you are about to see today or what you got yourselves into. This is a session on faith and divestment. And in the Philippines, we are actually one of the top countries in who are affected by climate change. And yet, a lot of our energy is actually from non-renewable sources of energy from fossil fuels. In fact, three-fourths of our country's power generation comes from fossil fuels, with coal alone accounting for 52% of produced electricity. Now, in today's session, we will be talking about the faith's role in this fight for climate justice, because globally and especially in the Philippines as well, faith groups are definitely among the most active leaders in campaigning for fossil fuel divestment because they want to lead by example on what it means to be stewards of creation. And although we will be talking about the Philippine context, I'm sure and I hope and I'm sure that your learnings from today will be applicable to the global context or wherever you're from. And also, one of the most affected sectors in our society is the youth, because this isn't just about the future for them, the future in 100 years or so. This is the present actually of what they're living in. It's no longer a question of when, but it's actually now, and by how much and how can we stop it. So today we will be having the following speakers. We will have from the Living Laudato Si Philippines, John Leo Algo, who is a environmental scientist and also deputy executive director. And we will also be having Bishop Gerardo Alminaza, who is a bishop in the Diocese of San Carlos. And that's actually a place where renewable energy is at the top, at its peak. And then we also have Joshelle Magrasha, who will represent the youth. So, just a few house rules. Sorry, I'm taking quite a while. Just a few house rules. If you have any questions, please put them in the question and answer tab. So there's a question answer tab there. Feel free to introduce yourselves in the chat. Please be kind and courteous. And of course, if you have any, you have trouble following with hearing probably, there are actually subtitles in the bottom. So you can see this logo that says CC live transcript. You can turn that on. That will immediately make English subtitles for you. If we're speaking English, it will be English. Most likely we will be speaking English. And if you want to turn it off, if it bothers you, just click the CC button. And let's move on to our first speaker of the evening. We have John Leo Algo, who is the Deputy Executive Director of Living Laudato Si Philippines, to talk about fossil fuel in the Philippines. He is a climate advocate, environment researcher, and citizen journalist. So, JL, you have the floor.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen from the Philippines. My name is John Leo Algo, JL for short, and I would like to thank each and every one of you for attending this session on faith and divestment. So, as Winken mentioned, I will be discussing to you about the fossil fuel context in the Philippines.
Are you all right there?
My laptop is hanging. Please spare me a couple of seconds. That's unexpected. So, anyway, I will be speaking to you about, again, fossil fuels in the Philippine context. So, while my uh, PowerPoint is loading, my apologies again. I would like to start by talking about the number one, which in many contexts seems to be a small number, but in the context of climate change, it may be the most important number of all, because that is around the level of global warming that our planet is currently experiencing at this very moment. And for the Philippine context specifically, we are one of the most vulnerable countries to the climate crisis. And of course, now, uh, that's the current situation, 1 degree Celsius of global warming. What if we reach the following number, 1.5? And that is the one of the primary targets under the Paris Agreement, specifically to limit global warming to well below 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial temperatures. My laptop finally responded. And to pursue efforts to limit it to way below to up to 1.5 degrees Celsius. Because do we really want to live in a world that is warmer by 2, 3, or even 4 degrees Celsius? And many experts have said as well that 1.5 degrees Celsius may be the point of no return, meaning if global warming exceeds that limit, it may be difficult for countries, and especially for countries at high risk, like the Philippines, countries in the Asia Pacific, among others, to mitigate or even reverse some of the impacts of climate change. So there's the 1.5 degrees Celsius number. But in the Philippine context, I would like to focus now on the fossil fuel generation mix. This is the share of power generation in the Philippines by source in 1998, where oil was the most dominant source of basically electricity in the country. Now, 2008, this was around the time of the passage of the Renewable Energy Law in the Philippines, which aims to spur the transition from fossil fuels to renewable energy development as much as possible. And around this time, we can see here that from 10 years prior, natural gas and coal have actually increased in terms of share in its energy mix. Now, with the passage of the RE law, we would expect that the Philippines' renewable energy share will be higher. But data from the Department of Energy shows that in 2018, coal has actually doubled in terms of its share in the country's power generation mix. And in fact, the overall share of renewable energy has actually decreased from 34% back in 2008 to around 25% 10 years after. So this shows the addiction of Philippines to coal, the growing dependency of the country to dirty energy. So to answer the question, are we addicted to coal? The answer is yes. And in fact, we have currently a national installed coal capacity of up to 9.8 gigawatts. And 16 new coal-fired power plants have been added to our national coal fleet since the year 2010. However, it's also important to note that there has been no new added coal-fired power plants in the country since 2017. The Philippines also ranks as the ninth biggest coal expansionist in the world out of 60 countries, and there are still many coal-fired power plants and other coal projects in the pipeline as of September 2019. And in fact, it could reach up to 13.8 gigawatts or 23 new coal-fired power plants in the pipeline for the Philippines. So, and unfortunately, this coal expansion has been due to several factors. One, of course, can cite an unfavorable policy environment in the Philippines for renewable energy development, but still favors the expansion of coal. But on the other hand, we also need to look at coal financing, specifically which Philippine banks have financed coal projects in the last decade alone. And here we can see a list of 15 major Philippine banks, most notably Bank of the Philippine Islands, BDO Unibank, among others. So these are some of the major finance shares of coal in the Philippines. And here we have a chart of Philippine banks' coal financing, specifically in terms of share of value underwritten and share of loans issued. Now, despite only being the fourth largest bank in the Philippines, the bank with the greatest coal exposure, as shown in the chart, is BPI, who issued around 3.48 billion US dollars since then in over 28 deals, having a total value of 13.2 billion US dollars in loans. And BPI specifically was key to the financing of at least 15 coal-fired power plants and 6 coal developer companies with deals maturing up to December of 2030, which means 10 years from now, we're supposed to be achieving the SDGs, we're supposed to be limiting global warming in a country that's very vulnerable to climate change, and yet we could still expect up to 10 years from now some more coal-fired power plants, courtesy of these banks such as BPI. In the same length, the largest bank in the Philippines, BDO, has also financed up to 14 coal plants and worth 2.52 billion US dollars. So this is the situation in the Philippines in terms of major Philippine banks financing coal projects. So this is the context for the push for divestment from fossil fuels here in the Philippines, which is basically exerting social, political, and economic pressure for the institutional withdrawal of assets, including stocks, bonds, and other financial instruments connected to companies involved in extracting fossil fuels. It's important to note that divestment is not an overnight process. It also doesn't necessarily mean that in a blink of an eye, institutions or organizations can immediately shift their assets away from coal financiers or those who fund environmentally destructive activities and immediately shift or reinvest in more sustainable ventures. It takes time, but the more important thing about divestment is that it exerts social, political, economic pressure that forces these financial institutions and other leading authorities, whether in the local or global context, to enact the right kind of policy changes leading towards sustainability, especially in the context of renewable energy development. And as of April 2020, globally speaking, there have been nearly 1,200 institutions, over 58,000 individuals, and worth that have divested worth 14 trillion US dollars of assets. So, and it's important to note that perhaps the sector that is the leader or has the biggest presence in the fossil fuel divestment movement in the world is our faith-based institutions, which will be tackled on by our following speakers. And to draw inspiration for more context behind divestment, we look at one of perhaps the most significant statements from Pope Francis's second encyclical Laudato Si on care for a common home, which shows that both everyday experience and scientific research show that the gravest effects of all attacks on the environment are suffered by the poorest, and to add to that, the most vulnerable and marginalized communities every single time. So here in the Philippines, there have been several networks of civil society groups, among others, that have been working to promote divestment, especially from coal, which, as we showed previously, is the largest share of power generation in the country. And Living Laudato Si Philippines in particular is part of the Withdraw from Coal network, which again aims to pressure banks to change their policies towards more sustainable ventures. And one of the products of Withdraw from Coal, one of our major activities, is the Coal Divestment Scorecard, which is uh, basically a first-time initiative here in the Philippines, where we rated 15, the 15 major Philippine banks that we showed previously in terms of three categories: coal financing, coal divestment, and their degree of climate action. And as I mentioned previously, banks like DPI and BDO score the highest, which means that they are the furthest away from being a climate-friendly bank, especially when talking about divestment from fossil fuels, especially coal. They are the furthest from that particular direction. Also, Living Laudato Si Philippines is engaged with faith-based institutions for promoting not only divestment from coal, but also more ecologically sound activities in communities, parishes, and dioceses across the country. And we have engaged with, for example, the Catholic Bishops' Conference of the Philippines in the drafting and the publication of this pastoral letter, an urgent call for ecological conversion, hope in the face of climate emergency a few years ago. And one of the 13 ecological actions that is included in the CBCP pastoral letter is divestment from coal and investment towards more sustainable activities, including renewable energy. Also, as part of our efforts, LLS is trying to raise awareness by the use of articles and other forms of publication, including our SDG and Laudato Si handbook, which aims to empower readers to rethink about their notion of development. Do we want a fossil fuel based development that has led to the ecological crisis that we're experiencing? Or do we want something that is more sustainable? And that is done through looking at the SDGs and Laudato Si, two particular fields of thought that seem to be different, but they actually can complement one another. And we are also involved in developing a Divest Invest course, which hopefully would empower religious treasurers and other faith-based finance officers in the country to initiate divestment within their respective parishes, dioceses, and among other institutions. To close, I would like to point out two particular facts. Number one, there's no such thing as a single perfect solution. And if we look at our nature, the most resilient systems are the most diverse. And when it comes to divestment, I think it's important for us to start not only divesting from the destructive practices of our past, but we should also invest in our future. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you very much, JL. And just it was just brought to my attention that there's actually no Q&A tab. So if you could just save your questions for the forum later, and then you can type it in the chat, or we'll ask you to raise your hand if you have a question. So just save your questions for the forum. All right. And then next we have our speaker, Bishop Gerardo Alminaza, who is the Bishop of the Diocese of San Carlos. Now, for a little background, Bishop Jerry, as he is fondly called, was assigned to the Diocese of San Carlos on the island of Negros in the Philippines as its third bishop in 2013. And this just so happens to be the time when Super Typhoon Yolanda also taught us important lessons on climate change, that it is happening now. And ever since he's been part of the fight, his parish has been part of the fight for keeping Negros as the renewable capital of the Philippines and Southeast Asia. It is actually they are also actually fighting for the against the 300 megawatt SMC global coal-fired power plant in San Carlos City. And he stands by a strong conviction that it is a human right to live in a clean, healthy, and safe environment, which in fact San Carlos is. San Carlos City is also recognized by the United Nations as one of the most livable cities in the world. So, here to talk about accomplishments and challenges of churches and faith groups in pushing for divestment, here is Bishop Jerry. Oh, Bishop Jerry, I think you're on mute. Yes.
Okay, hello everybody. Thank you so much for being here, and I'm happy also to be able to be part of this sharing on the role of faith and the faith-based groups in the effort to campaign for divestment from something that really destroy the environment, particularly coal. So I'll just pattern my sharing on the see, discern, act process. Let's go to the C portion. Actually, the C portion was already presented by the previous speaker, JL. And this is just a summary. He has given us actually, the next slide please. He has given us actually a more updated one because his data was in 2020, but mine is at 2019. It's 12 trillion, but he said it's already 14 trillion, I think. And a majority of these institutions that have divested already from fossil fuels are faith-based community, 150 of which are Catholic, and it involves 58,000 individuals. Now let's try to look at the situation from the faith perspective. Let's discern what does God say about this situation right now. Next slide, please. From the very first book of the sacred scriptures in the book of Genesis, we have the Lord particularly assigning to us this beautiful paradise, and we are supposed to keep it that way, to work for it, work with it, and really keep it, no, as it is. But sad to say, as even Pope Francis mentioned in his Laudato Si encyclical, it's mainly human activity that destroys this beautiful paradise that God has given us. Next slide, please. And then he is very clear in his instruction in the book of Numbers that we are not supposed to pollute the land wherein we live. We should not defile the land which we live, in the midst of which the Lord dwell in the midst of the people. And so, but we witness around us just the opposite, no? So we are not paying attention to this instruction of the Lord. Next step, slide please. And also Pope Francis, which was also shared with us by JL earlier, um, the problem and the challenge for us is precisely this human activity, which has the greatest effect on the environment, is suffered mostly by the most vulnerable sector of our society, the poorest of the poor. And that is something that any reasonable person should not just tolerate or just sit back idly. Next, please. Uh, the same encyclical of the Pope, 165, he said that technology based on the use of highly polluting fossil fuels, especially coal, but also oil and to a lesser degree gas, needs to be progressively replaced without delay. And this is precisely the specific statement of the Pope that gives me the courage, the inspiration to stand up against big companies who are trying to establish coal-fired power plants, particularly in our island in Negros, but in any other parts of the country. Next slide, please. So what are the ways forward? Please, next. Um, the CBCP, in our pastoral letter that was mentioned by JL also a while ago, we really reminded people that we are in the climate emergency now. And one of the 13 action plans or call to action is really divestment from coal. And even before this pastoral letter, the movement for divestment already started. And at the moment, it is also gaining some impetus. No? Next, please. Who are the Philippine Catholic institutions that committed to divestment? Actually, we are growing in number, but really the main protagonist is the CBCP, the Catholic Bishops' Conference of the Philippines, Caritas Philippines, my own diocese here in San Carlos, Environmental Science for Social Change, among others. Next, please. And this is one example when we launched this campaign, Withdraw from Coal, last in 2019 was it. Next, please. These are some of the ecological actions which our faith-based groups are initiating in our country. Integrating the care of creation as our common home in the Christian teaching, particularly in our Catholic schools. Minimizing consumption and proper waste management, protection of biodiversity, tree planting and growing, and forest reforestation. And also promoting diversified and sustainable agriculture, protection and conservation of oceans and marine resources. But among these actions, we have the divestment of Catholic financial resources from fossil fuels. Next, please. As a major repository of the resources of the Catholic Church in the Philippines, as a Filipino banking institution for the past 200 years, and as a responsible global corporate citizen, BPI is a part of the audience called upon by our church to take action because BPI has led the way in the Philippine banking. And now we ask, this is part of the letter that we wrote to BPI a year ago. And I attended also its General Assembly of Stakeholders and spoke there. And now we are really challenging them to be more serious, to walk the talk. So this is part of the letter that we challenge them to divest their financing from coal and fossil fuels. Next, please. So in my diocese here in San Carlos City particularly, we have these sources of renewable energy, and actually in the whole Negros Island, 97% we produce renewable energy, but sad to say, more than 70% of our electric consumption is coming from dirty source of energy like coal. Next, please. And so this is one part here that this is supposed to be the area where they were planning originally to build the coal-fired power plant. But somehow last year, oh no, in 2 years ago, we succeeded to convince the provincial government led by the former Governor Marañon to declare Negros Occidental a coal-free province and a hub for renewable energy. Next, please. So far, the young people here, together with the faith-based groups and many other environment groups in Negros, have kept Negros coal-free. And one of our important action is really influencing the financial institutions to divest from coal. And we hope that we will succeed. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Bishop Jerry. And right now, let's move on to the youth, from a representative from the youth sector. We have Joshelle Magracia. And Joshelle is a grade 12 honor student. She's 18 years old and she advocates for the environmental protection. Her house is actually located just steps away from the coal-fired power plant in Bataan, and that motivates her advocacy in protecting nature. Her organization, the Youth Bataeños Environmental Advocacy Network, or YBEN, campaigns for social justice and climate justice. She was able to see how inequality makes capitalism reign and take advantage of the environment in our society. So here's Joshelle. This is a pre-recorded video, but she's here for the open forum.
Good day, I am Joshua Magracia, a youth activist from Young Bataenos Environmental Advocacy Network from the Philippines. All of us wants to live peacefully with our Mother Nature, to be able to breathe fresh air and clean air, to hear the humming of the birds. We all want a peaceful and happy life. I live in a village called Lamao in the province of Bataan, Philippines. I still remember once we had a serene life, enjoying the bounty of nature, but not until things became different and our way of living have changed. Studies around the world have proven that the big polluters, such as coal, oil, and gas, fuel climate crisis. By their continuing business as usual stance as their continuing denial of the negative impacts and damages that their dirty business have caused to the many communities, like in the case of my community in Bataan. I want you to imagine living in a community beside the beside the coal power plant. It is a few steps away from our house. Right now, we are experiencing a lot of issues that cause so much anxieties. Instead of birds humming, we are disturbed by the deafening noise coming from the coal plant. Coal ash or dust falls down practically everywhere. Sadly, the fresh air we used to breathe has gone. Only the smell of burnt rubber, a rotten egg, and sulfur linger in the atmosphere, shattering our lungs and makes our people sick. Our ocean is polluted. Reports in Reports in the past said that 13 species of fish have been found contaminated by heavy and toxic metals like mercury and lead. Because of that, the source of living or the source of the livelihood of our community is being compromised. Also, before there was ample source of clean water. We used to have free flows or springs everywhere, which our community use for their domestic use. Now, every free flows have dried up, and there are cases of water being rationed or scheduled in service. Sadly, what used to be a simple but peaceful life then has gone, and now exists only in our dream because everything has changed and destroyed. Everything have happened because we are a community that hosts a coal-fired power plant. We are suffering because of this kind of business. We became the sacrificial lambs so that this dirty fossil fuel business will thrive and prosper. Is this the kind of life we have dreamed of living in the future? Or maybe it could be worse. This unsustainable and destructive industry motivates us to organize and to take action. Alongside with other sectors in the community, the Young Bataeños Environmental Advocacy Network has been motivated by their inspiring experiences to fight, protect, and defend human rights and the environment. We as a youth believes that it is urgent to educate ourselves so we would acquire the skills and knowledge to take action, mobilize together with the other sectors in the community. It is important that we engage and decide for our sake and for our future. Let's not wait for things to happen before us and our future to be handed to us by the older generation because it will be our future and life at stake. Hence, we should demand that business and government to listen to us, listen to the people suffering and stop disregarding their rights. We urge them to stop fueling climate change that is causing damage to people's lives, livelihood, and environment. Make our voice matter in every issues in the community that concern our environment and our future. More so, we have to demand the accountability for the big polluters for polluting our environment, thus jeopardizing our planet and our future. We not also forget to seek out our government to uphold its mandate that is to respect, protect, and fulfill human rights. We as a collective must strive hard to protect our environment like the way it protects us and provide us what we need to survive and thrive. Let's strive to create systems that prioritize humanity over profit, respect and love God over greed, believes in equality over the interest to oneself. Meantime, we must continue our solidarity to sustain this noble struggle for climate justice, for our future, for our one common home. Thank you.
Thank you, Joshelle. And with that, we would like to open our open forum. So if you have any questions, you may please type them in the chat box, or you may actually ask them live through audio if you press raise your hand in the reactions. So we'll be able to see if you're asking a question. There's no need for you to turn on your video. You can just turn on your audio if you have any questions. So I guess while there are no questions yet, just a general question for everyone. Oh, yes. Would you like to ask a question? Okay. All right. So just a general question for everyone. Why did you choose to focus? Oh, okay. We have a question now. I would just like to ask this general question to everyone. Why did you choose fossil fuel divestment as your campaign for right now? Like, why is it your focus? Why do you think this is the problem that we need to address immediately? What effects did it have in your life, etc.? JL, would you like to answer that?
Certainly. For my case, at least from personal experience, I've my background is actually more from climate science and a bit of policy. And then I heard about the first time I heard about the fossil fuel divestment campaign was a few years ago, and it piqued my interest because it's certainly, while it's certainly related to the previous endeavors that I was involved in, it's also very different because it's a different way of for institutions, individuals, and organizations to voice out uh, their calls, their concerns for a just transition towards more sustainable ventures, especially in the context of climate action, renewable energy development. And for me, it also more directly tackles what I think it has been an aspect regarding environmental action that is rather, in my opinion at least, under focused. And that is the fact that fossil fuel companies, coal-fired power plants, they will not exist, or at least they won't proliferate without financing. So it's basically also linked to uh, what the Laudato Si says, because I'm LLS, which involves tackling the root, one of the root causes, and that involves uh, financing, basically prioritizing profits over planetary and human health. And that's why I'm currently involved in fossil fuel divestment campaign.
Thank you very much. Actually, I think that the other speakers have answered that question already in their presentation. So I guess I just want to ask what has been the response in general to our efforts. So let's ask particularly the question here is what was the response of local banks in your call for divestment from fossil fuel?
Yeah, we wrote the banks, no, and then initially their response was to explain to us that they cannot just withdraw their divestment. I mean their investment and financing, and so we have to give them time. But then we need some more concrete timetable from them. So we're really asking them to be more specific. So so far, BPI has has not been very definitive as RCBC, who really made the announcement that they will already stop financing. Although it is not something written, we still have to see the policy that they have made. But BPI is still in a way not straightforward in really declaring that they will stop financing already, because many of there are still many they have still many projects really invested on coal, and in some places the communities there are really protesting, like in Atimunan, and yet we find the response still very weak and not so committed, sad to say. That's why in their coming general assembly we still would like to press more concrete action from them. So I'm using this platform now to appeal. In case you are investing or depositing on BPI, please make your voice heard too. Write them before their General Assembly on April 22. Thank you.
Thank you, Bishop Jerry. And I would like to ask a question for Joshelle. So, because you are part of the youth community, the youth, your Y band, is it right? Is that right? So, Youth Bataeños. Yes. And how has the response been to your actions, to your platform, to your advocacies? Like the response from, let's say, the government, the local government, or the coal-fired power plant that's next to your house. How has the response been to your actions?
So their the response of the LGU, the government of our community is still weak. They are still ignoring the rights of the living of our community, they are still ignoring it. So likewise, it is, we are still campaigning for it. We are still, by that, we are compromised by the government and businesses. And we, they listen more to the uh, to the corporations, and by that we are still in action to fight for our rights, to for us to listen to us. We are voicing out our voice to um, to keep them knowing that we are sacrificing. Yes.
Thank you so much. And just going off of that, right? Have you guys ever received any threats from your advocacy, from fighting for this advocacy?
Yeah, so far, yes. We are still receiving some threats about it. We are still in, we are still receiving some red tag, not only by the government, but also regards on the community itself, on the workers,
Yes.
on the
Yes.
business staff. We are we are receiving some threats, but we are not we are not minding them because we we build unity and faith for us to proceed to our fight for the for our community, not only for our community, but also for our environment.
Yes. Thank you. And last question, just for the divestment from international oil companies, is it possible, according here, that instead of divesting from they divest from international oil companies, this will just lead to more investments in state-owned oil companies. So would it therefore be better to call for greater regulation of state-owned oil companies?
Okay.
Yes,
Um,
JL?
uh, it, just to clarify, Winkin, is this the last question already?
Yes, because we don't have enough time, unfortunately.
Okay. I'd like to answer that along with the other question here because they're sort of related. It was asked here, what happens to the assets when the divestment takes place? Are they sold to another financial institution? Are they simply written off? So basically, just to answer both questions as best as I could within our given time, uh, that's why we need to couple divestment with in reinvestment because after financial institutions, after faith groups, after shareholders withdraw or divest or basically shift their assets away from, for example, a company that funds coal projects. What happens to that particular? What happens to the money? What happens to the assets? So ideally, they would try to find a more, not necessarily more. They'll try to find another venture, another business that hopefully would yield uh, at least some kind of increased return, when it comes to their money. And that's one of the challenges that, at least for divestment campaigns here in the Philippines, that facing is that not the current political and economic policies. They do not necessarily uh, lean or favor the development or the growth of renewable energy, for example. Just to give an example, here in the Philippines, the renewable energy law, it has been passed for over almost 13 years now, but it's still, the full implementation has only recently begun. So, and to add to that, the Bangko Sentral ng Pilipinas, Central Bank of the Philippines, they released last year a sustainable finance framework, which would sort of a regulatory policy, to to make sure that banks comply more for more sustainable practices, investments, among others. But those particular policies are still basically in their infancy stage compared to perhaps other countries that have had more successes when it comes to divestment and reinvestment efforts. So as I mentioned previously, divestment is not the only solution. In fact, there's no such thing as a singular perfect solution. And that's why we need to focus on we need to focus on the other aspects as well to make sure that the momentum that will be created by pressuring these institutions to divest from pollutive industries, especially coal, will that momentum will be translated into something more meaningful, something that's more also financially sound. Of course, we want to make sure that uh, we want to work together. We don't want to necessarily burn bridges, no, or be completely adversarial to these banks. We want to because at the end of the day, we all want to have that kind of sustainable world. But it's about building bridges. And one last thing, we need to make sure that communities like Joshel's will never have to experience uh, the things that they have experienced. So that to me uh, is very important when it comes to the concept of divestment. We also need to find other other ventures for reinvestment because she's right. You can the one who asked the question has a good point. If you divest, for example, from a private corporation, you sell your assets so that you can divest from, for example, again, a coal or an oil company, and then you just invest your assets in something else, but also equally polluted. That's not necessarily good the good kind of divestment. So we have to think of other steps, and that's I think what uh, at least for us here in the Philippines, Withdraw from Coal Network, among other campaigners, we need to also figure out the reinvestment part. That's why we try to say as much as possible, divest, invest.
Thank you so much. And actually, we have time for one more question. If there are any more questions, please type them in the chat. Although we do have a question here about food security. Is food security, for example, a an area where we would like to invest our money instead, or what other places can we invest our money instead of fossil fuels?
Simon is raising his hand.
Oh, yes, sorry. Simon, do you have a question?
Yes, I'd like to just say that because from here in the UK, it's quite frustrating really the fact that the message, the Laudato Si message, is not filtering down to the grassroots level to like my local church. There's very little mention of to the congregation, and it's not really part of the narrative of what we should be doing to protect the natural, God's creation. And I just think with this, if people were made more aware, for instance, in the faith community, if we were to say, let's get together and then call for action, then that should be a kind of driving force, and it doesn't have a political kind of agenda. It's a faith and kind of spiritual agenda to try and protect the earth, so and God's creation. So, and I think if that was, I don't know what the situation is in the Philippines, whether again there's that kind of bearing in mind obviously it's a very Christian Catholic country, in that the mass of people, if they were behind a call for to oppose destructive and polluting coal and other sort of fossil fuel fired power stations, that if for that kind of call from the people to say we don't want any more of this, we want more green, we want only investment in green sort of power generation. So I don't know whether there is that call for as I say for the for congregations and people to sort of have a collective voice. Is there much of that in the Philippines?
Bishop Jerry, JL, Joshelle?
I would say so. It's becoming louder, but we still have to continue. I never imagined as a bishop to be joining the shareholders meeting, but now I am realizing that's part of the platform we have even to go to in order to proclaim the message. And so, and we have to tell them it's from the moral ground, because we cannot allow our money coming from the poor people in the collection boxes deposited in their banks to be used on companies and businesses that also kill them and also destroy our environment. So that's the bottom line for me. But the young people are really very amazing here. I am really inspired as a bishop by their response to the call of Laudato Si. The whole the Negros Island is composed of 2 provinces, and both provinces have declared ourselves to be coal-free and a hub for renewable energy. And now we are in the process of working as we have a technical working group that will help the transition, the roadmap to transition to renewable energy. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Bishop Jerry. And thank you, Simon, for the question. And JL, would you like to add to answering that question?
I was actually going to say something similar to Bishop. But I guess to add to that, we've been working with, of course, I mentioned Withdraw from Coal Network earlier. It's not just LLS that's involved in that. It also involves other civil society groups here in the Philippines. But we always make sure to engage with faith institutions and religious leaders like Bishop Jerry, because we believe in the moral authority, that moral voice that I think is very important in the messaging when it comes to campaigning for coal divestment, and to also highlight social justice, among others. That's about it.
All right, that's all we have for our open forum. Thank you so much for your wonderful questions. And moving on to the next portion of our webinar, which is our call to action. So we actually have a petition on our website open. Our website is livinglaudatosi.org.ph, and you can sign the petition of a letter to our banks and Catholic institutions to divest from coal. So this petition, this letter, is actually open to any bank, international, because of the context. It's our banks in general. So we want the banks to use the money of the people to help the people and not endanger their lives. And you may also subscribe to our newsletter for further announcements and updates on divestment. And then tomorrow we will also be having a webinar about faith and divestment as well. The speakers tomorrow will be Reverend Fletcher Harper, the Executive Director of Green Faith, and Maria Jaya Ariola, who is a core group member of Youth for Climate Hope, and as well as John Leo Algo as well. And for your certificate, you can request for certificate in participation at the email we're showing here in the screen in front of you, contact@justrecoverygathering.org. Certificates will be sent a few weeks after the event. And just for additional mentioning, the Living Laudato Si is also part of the Global Catholic Climate Movement and Global Catholic Climate Movement Filipinas, and it's also a member of the Withdraw from Coal initiative. This initiative is actually a collective of organizations, non-government organizations, and the like, who support fossil fuel divestment. And also, you may follow us in our social media. right here. So we're on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and LinkedIn, all Laudato Si PH. And that's all that we have for today. Thank you so much for attending our session, and we hope to see you tomorrow as well. Thank you so much to our speakers, Bishop Jerry, Joshelle, and John Leo Algo. Thank you for sharing your insights and also for sharing your experiences and your knowledge. And thank you also to the participants for your questions and your listening, for taking the time to really be here today. Actually, just to share, like most of us in the Philippines, most of us here from Living Laudato Si Philippines has experienced climate change in person. We've experienced flash floods. We've experienced Typhoon Ondoy, for example, Typhoon Frank. They're not as famous as Yolanda, but they're equally as scarring. Well, not equally as scarring, but they are pretty traumatizing. And this definitely fuels us to keep pushing forward and keep the fight going. So we hope that you learned something today, and we hope that you can apply these to your context as well. So thank you, everyone.
Wait lang sa alarms.
Thank you, everyone, for coming. Oh no, I threw an alarm.
Okay na. Yay! We're on time.
Yes.
We can stop the recording na siguro.